welcome, guys, to the inaugural Beyond the Horizon Not podcast. We still need to figure out what name we call it, Beyond Podcast, to keep people's interest. But thanks for your time jumping into this. Great to have you guys. I'm going to throw a topic at you, and I'm going to ask you to maybe have a debate around it, and I will throw my 2 cents every so often just to upset the balance. So the question is work from home dead on arrival? And I'm going to throw that at Chris first.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I mean, it's an open topic, right? I mean, work from home. I guess the new phrase is hybrid, but again, so that you can work from home, so you can work from the office. My general view is, why does it matter, right? So specifically, if you're in a role that you have to physically be in front of something or do something in a particular place, then work from home may still have a place, but probably less than if you're in a different role. But no, I don't think it's dead on arrival at all. I think it's just another way in which you can ensure that your employees are productive as possible and engaged as possible. But I would say that, right?
I probably should put a little bit more meat on the bone as well with that comment. And the reason I'm asking that question is because all we see in the news today, or well, not today, but over the last 2 weeks, basically, has been every CEO on the planet is pushing the agenda of let's get back to the office, mandates for 3 to 5 days back in the office. Nobody wants to work from home anymore. That's all we're seeing. So I'm just curious whether we agree or disagree that work from home is a good way of doing it. Our CEO is going to push that agenda so hard that it just kills it, regardless of whether it's a good proposition or not. But Charles, thoughts?
Yeah, I think if there was ever anything decent that came out from COVID, which is a bold statement to make, it has to be the fact that people now realise that working from anywhere is actually an opportunity. So anybody who's been in IT or anybody who's been in senior leadership roles for the best part of 20 years will know that this has always been possible from various different technologies. So now Pandora's box has been opened. I think it's the right thing to do. I think that whole mixture, absolutely. I don't think it should always all pivot to remote work. It can be quite isolating in terms of just being a brain at the end of a telephone at times, and you just get called for ideas. So I think it's absolutely right to come into the office couple of days a week and have those as your core statutory days where as a team you come together. But I think that flexibility to be able to do the rest of your job where the job can be done, it doesn't even need to be your home. As long as you get the job done, I don't think it really matters. The job should just be the output, not the location. I think it's great. I think a hybrid is probably the right way to go.
I just cut across, Charles, I think you made a great point there around as long as work's getting done, which kind of makes me then think, well, why is it even a discussion, right? I mean, it must be a perception that work isn't being done, and that by presenteeism, right, equals work being done. There's two sides of that, I guess. One is the business structured in a way that, I guess, allows you to be productive, but also are people taking the proverbial, right? Is there a proportion of people that actually are sat at home doing nothing, not producing? I guess that's the debate, but
that's not technology. That's a cultural challenge. Which, I mean, those companies which are already set up as remote first. So when you started into the pandemic, they fared pretty well on this because all their processes and all their governance has been around. If you're in the office or you're at home, there's no kind of first class or second class citizens. You share the same information, you have the same types of discussions, you document the same way, use the same systems. So those have fared pretty well in that. We saw right at the very start of the whole real shift to hybrid, where large organizations were actually tracking what people were doing on their computers, and they saw actually if people aren't hitting keys on a keyboard, then they're not actually working. Well, I do a lot of my work in paper. I'm old school. In my 40s, and that's how I like to make notes. So you can't say that I'm not being productive because I'm doodling or I'm actually taking my notes in the book. It doesn't matter as long as the job gets done. So I agree with you. It's I think there's a cultural and a trust issue that has to be overcome.
On that point, then, you say that a lot of CEOs, Brian. Let's look at some of those high-profile CEOs. I can't get my three-letter acronyms out. CEOs. Let's look at those. So we're thinking Elon Musk, maybe.
Yeah, Andy Jazzy
let's take,
famously last week, he came out and said, Andy Jazzy came out last week and said, for those of you who are not coming back for the 3 mandated days, it's not going to work out for you at Amazon.
Okay, right, and then look at some of like Alan Sugar is another. I think he's been quite against it. A lot of those are very entrepreneurial, who probably started off from a rags to riches type story, who believe in hard work to get to where they are. So this kind of goes back to that point where you said maybe it's a trust issue. I think there's a lot of CEOs who sort of think, well, hold on, I got to where I am by doing this, working every hour God send, all right, in order to get to where I am, which goes back to if you want to get anywhere, to be hardworking, etc., and to be successful, you need to be putting in the time. If you're at home, you're probably not putting in the time. So it comes back to that trust. I reckon if you look at some of the other CEOs, a bit more seasoned, as in they didn't make it up from an entrepreneurial, probably rose through the ranks, from a university background, maybe that way, and sort of got to where maybe don't own the company per se, rather than the major shareholder, or just they probably may have a different view. So I think it very much depends on the type and the background. And I think it comes back to old adages coming back into their thinking, which is, well, how can you be really, really hard working when you're at home? There's too many distractions for you. So it ultimately comes back to trust. But we all know that when the pandemic hit, it worked, didn't it? And you say it's dead on arrival. It makes me wonder about, and I was talking to Chris about this yesterday when we called up. I've been off for a few weeks, shall we say. And I was talking about reviews. So when you first buy something, the first 2 weeks, it's the honeymoon period, so to speak, right? It's brilliant. Everything's amazing. Yeah, it just works. Like a new device. You go around and go, hey, look at my new device. Then come the next month, you're like, yeah, it's okay. Oh, I've started to find this out. And then 6 months later, the true test is afterwards. And I wonder whether you said it's dead on arrival. I think it was great on arrival. I think what's happened over the last 2-3 years, people have decided, well, there are bad things about it. There's a lot of good things, which then kind of goes back to maybe we don't want to do it all the time. And for some people, it doesn't make sense completely being remote and never seeing any of their colleagues, versus it's probably somewhere in the middle, which is pretty much all things in life, isn't it? Somewhere in the middle where is the truth lies, right? So I think it's something that we need to do. I just think it's different perspectives, and it depends who's at the top and how they got there, and the kind of sort of image they want to portray on their staff and the culture.
So what about how the kind of communication dynamics change? So basically, remote work requires very heavily on a technological experience, whereas maybe face to face in office doesn't so much. So what are our thoughts around that and the different dynamics?
I think when we say that from a technology company, I think we naturally jump onto technology being a problem or facilitator very early on in the whole kind of pandemic. I never talk about pandemic because it's a 3 year.
I'll get away from it.
It's so 3 years ago, so last year. How many times did we schedule a call because you had to schedule a call? How many times did you schedule a Zoom call, a team call? And it just removes any kind of spontaneity. It kind of an expectation. That's the agenda. That's what we're going to talk about. So I quite quickly started just picking up the phone and irritating people by calling. Chris, you might remember that. Spencer, you might remember that. Sorry, Brian, I didn't do it to you. But Chris and my team, I just literally pick the phone up and just have a chat, find out what we're doing, how we're getting on. Just old school, the kind of stuff we used to do when you were a child.
You hit the nail on the head there, though, and I'm sure Chris may not, because he's not as old as us, Charles. But you mentioned
older.
But is that right for a certain demographic? And I know we probably had a conversation around this and demographics before, but not everybody likes a phone call.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I would separate ageism necessarily or demographics with experience, right? Because you can have a lot of experience in something and be young. You have more experience in a particular area and be young than someone who's maybe more senior, but their work experience or their particular experience of something is less. And the reason I bring that out is when we started doing pandemic, we will get off the subject, I guess, at some point, but during the pandemic, when everybody had to work remotely all of a sudden, who was used to going into the office, people like myself, and I know you, Charles, as well, we've kind of worked in what we would now class as hybrid for, let's say, over a decade, just to be polite, more to you than me. And so we have ways of working. And so when everyone went remote, right, it became a nightmare for people like us, because suddenly we had a structured way of doing things that got blown up by people trying to do what they would do physically, but in a virtual. And I hate using the phrase virtual because we're having a chat now. It's not a virtual chat. We're just remote from each other. But those types of things drove me crazy. And then it started to settle down. And I think the whole productivity issue around how do I know that they're working, when the pandemic happened and for the first maybe probably 12 to 18 months, there was all these reports about productivity's actually increased for those types of workers. They're getting more work done. Part of it you could say was the people trying to vote that up so that they could work more like that because there are some benefits. But the other side was maybe actually it's true, but it might have been true because you had nothing else to do. You were literally locked in your house. You couldn't go anywhere. So you worked, and people did maybe work more hours than they were used to. And maybe then we started to settle down. So the productivity's gone down a little bit, but only gone down from the spike up, not gone down from pre-COVID.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure enough people have done enough digging into that. And part of it as well is that businesses, I guess,
we really measure it though before, Chris. That's the question.
That's true.
And probably we didn't because everybody was in the office or in the workplace, so we didn't care to measure it in the same way. Well, with certain verticals you probably would. If you're making stuff, you want to make sure that people are sticking to the targets of how many cars they're making per week or something. But the majority of people didn't have clear targets in that way, so you never measured it. So then there was this perceived, like you say, spike, but you've got no real benchmark from before. So you can't actually say whether it's more productive than what they were in the physical world.
It was measured previous to that by attendance. You were
Exactly.
in the building
point,
9 to 5. Therefore, you were working. You were productive, and I think the point was a lot of people actually weren't necessarily productive in that time. The perception was they were productive.
Well, define productive. People were in the office. You were paying them for them time. So even if they were chatting, they couldn't go anywhere else and do anything else. So hopefully they were chatting about work, vaguely related stuff. But they weren't able to go off and disappear. So therefore you were, okay, well, they might not be fully working, but at least they're not doing something else. So it's still good for me. And I'm still making sure that they're clocking in on time and clocking out. I think that's the perception, isn't it?
Yeah, it is a perception, card swipes. But I think you touched on something really valid there, Spencer, of define productivity and define, are people talking about work? Does it actually matter if they're not talking about work? Because that's how you build relationships. And that's what I was coming back to when you just picked up the phone and spoke to somebody, because those moments of, Spencer, tell me about your holidays. Not that I'm going to ask you a question because you've been away for far too long. You'll just take far too long this call to answer the question. But those sorts of questions are what we've always been called water cooler conversations. Those are missing. Those are really missing. How do you emulate that in this kind of world where everyone's hybrid? So I don't think necessarily you could always measure productivity in terms of having work conversations or swiping of badges, because just those random conversations you have with people build those relationships. And I think there's a whole kind of demographic or incoming generation of workers who are going to miss out on that, really genuinely miss out on how to have those types of engagements in the office if they're not having to be in the office.
I think, though, there's an element there around, right, so the water cooler moments. So you had those moments because you stumbled across people and therefore you had a conversation. If you still wanted to have those conversations, like you say, Charles, you can pick up the phone, you can Slack call someone, you can Teams call someone. I know all three of you in this call, I do that with randomly. We don't have to have fixed meetings. But that's because, two of the three of you I actually like and respect very much. You can work it out between you. But no,
one of them you just like but don't respect. One of them you.
But I think the generational thing as well. Going back to that thing again, some people don't feel the value or the benefit, right, of having those water cooler moments. So therefore, don't make the call, and that's all right for them. It shouldn't then be career limiting. And that's when you get into all sorts of stuff about people that are introverts versus extroverts, people that are somewhere in between, how they like to engage. I think the whole point is, if we're genuinely trying to move to this more diverse, inclusive world, then we need to find different ways of encouraging different people to work in different ways, rather than just go, right, the model is you come into an office, you do these 10 tasks, you check in, you check out, you leave. Because that's not driving anything innovation. And going back to your point much earlier in the call, Spencer, about these entrepreneurial people, how are they ever going to get more entrepreneurial people in their business if it's all very regimented in terms of how you work, where you work, what the outcomes are? That doesn't mean it's easy then. I think half the issue is if you're trying to come up with outcomes, which is how I always try and look at work, right? I don't care whether you go A to Z chronologically or you jump around the alphabet. If that's all the things you need to do, it doesn't matter how you do it as long as you get to the outcome. But it is hard to measure what the outcome is. And I think that's where the issue lies. A lot of people struggle to actually define the outcome is this. In certain roles, it's a lot more difficult, I appreciate. So then it falls in the too difficult category. And so it's much easier if I just tell you all to come into the office and we get back to presenteeism. But anyway, I'll get off my soapbox.
No, Chris, you do. I like that point, but at the same time, I know good examples through some members of my family who work for a large UK delivery service that was the one that originally was created, shall we say, not all of the newer ones. And they had it. I always used to say to them, "You're lucky, but you're not lucky," because he used to get up really, really early. This member of my family. Get his paper round, sorry, I'm not paper, his delivery round done very quickly. And then he had most of the afternoon off. Now, said company have stopped that now. But to your point, you said, well, it doesn't matter. They got the job done. They posted all the letters and all the parcels and they were finished. But then they said, no, we pay you for X amount of time. So then they started to string them out a bit more and they didn't care so much about delivering them. It's a really good point, which is, what are you paying?
Look at the impact, right? We're not mentioning the company, but I think we all know who the company is, given that we're all in the UK, right? The impact, it becomes anecdotally a joke about the level of service you get from that provider versus their competition. And I'm not saying that's the only thing that's made it different, but my interaction with those delivery drivers is very different to what it was 5-10 years ago, when they seem to be more engaged, actually proud to work for that establishment, right? And had those benefits, as you say, Spencer, do the rounds, and then that's the end of the day. That company maybe isn't factoring in the knock-on effect around employee experience, employee engagement to customer experience and customer engagement. Because if it was, it might want to do something about it.
So what's our feeling on kind of which of the models impacts work-life balance, employee engagement, the culture, basically overall? What's our perspective or feeling on which of these is the best fit overall? I know not specific individual customers, but just in general.
Well, horses for courses.
Yeah, I was just about to say it. There is no one size fits all the cliches you can come up with. By the way, if you say it's a cliche, is by saying it's a cliche in its own right. Just a little one pose of it. But yeah. I mean, but it's like anything, though. You have to go down and have a look and what's right for the particular company and what makes sense. I think we just said it. If you're making really, really expensive parts for cars in a manufacturing plant, you probably can't do that from home. And if you did, it would be probably operating robots or something, right? Maybe you can do that. I don't know. But you see my point. It's like there are certain roles that always need to be. I used to joke it was a nuclear submarine operator and pressing the button. I don't really want them to be using a bring your own device at home to do that. I kind of want them there, right? So it's a logical extreme, but it proves the point that you just need to look at your business and your organization and what makes sense. But you do need to understand that if you have got some people working from home because their role allows them to do so, and actually in a competitive market, you want those people, and that's the differentiator, versus other people in the organization who can't because of their role, that might lead to a different workforce or a dynamic. And you need to look into how you can level that up, so to speak. So there's that aspect as well that you need to think about. There isn't everyone can work from home in this organization. It's going to be based on the job, but there will be things you need to bear in mind.
Yeah, it depends what work is, right? So my youngest daughter at the moment has a part-time job in between college, cleaning, right? Clearly, she can't do that remotely because she's got to actually go and do the cleaning. But what she can do is schedule her shifts, get all her payroll information, pay slips, understand if there's extra work going on, see if there's an area, maybe move her shifts around or the areas that she's going to clean.
So the admin stuff she can do at home.
Exactly. It's that bit. So I was reading a post from Gabe Newth, I think it was, yesterday, where he was talking about the mix-up between employee experience and digital employee experience, and everyone's getting confused. And I was kind of thinking, well, why should they be different anyway? A lot of the interactions we have, personal and business-wise, are digital nowadays, right? So actually the key bit is it a digital experience or is it a physical experience? Or is it just an experience and therefore a mix of them? And I think that's where technology plays a part in allowing us to really think about outcomes, but also ways of working. And then you can have a conversation about certain roles, like I say, my daughter cleaning, actually having a digital remote aspect to it, rather than it all being, a place where you work as opposed to a thing that you do.
So thoughts on?
I just kind of add on to that one. So we talked about jobs, we talked about locations, but the thing we haven't mentioned is the industry it's working in. So those ones which are heavily regulated are always going to be stifled by what they can and can't do. So if you take financial services, you're going to have certain roles which can be performed anywhere, absolutely. But due to some of the FCA regulations, you just can't say like anti-money laundering, those types of roles, or investment banking. They have to be performed typically in the realms of a trusted location as well. And home just isn't that trusted location. So is that right or wrong? Don't know. It depends on how much you feel. Would you want to share your banking information with somebody who could take a pen and paper and actually jot that down at home? That comes down to trust as well. So there's always going to be certain regulated industries where the function looks like on paper it could work anywhere, but actually it can't due to the red tape which shackles it.
So let's talk a little bit around in the presumption that these are job functions that can be performed, hybrid, remote, or on site. Basically, let's talk about the cost implications for the business of those different ones between infrastructure, technology. What are our thoughts on, is there a specific model that stands out as the best optimized, or is there a wild difference between the three costs?
I think there's a perceived. Oh, yeah. You're going to go, Chris? I was going to say that I think there's a perceived cost. I think there's very much the notion of, if I'm looking after somebody who's only in one place, therefore they only need one device. So therefore the cost of managing it, securing it and everything, and I'm sure we'll talk about security in a minute, and the rest of the tech goes around it. But I do think there's a perceived notion that it's more complicated and therefore more costly to operate the ability for everybody to work anywhere at any time of day on any device, right? And where they want to do it, and from a security perspective as well. Whether that is the case, and I think it would even itself out, but I think there is a perceived notion that it's cheaper to do it the other way around. But then, as we just described, would you want to go into a company, if your role allowed for that, and you are able to do it from another one? Would you join that company if the first thing they said is, you only get one device, it's our device, it's really, really old? They probably wouldn't tell you it's really, really old, but you could probably make that assumption. And you can only use it from here at a certain time of day, and you have to do 55 billion things to get onto it. You know what I mean? It's really, but that's just the way it is. You might go, well, you know what? I'll go and work somewhere else where I think they've got a better way of doing it. So that's where it really would become apparent. And therefore, the cost might be lower in terms of the IT budget, but the cost to the business overall around not getting the right people.
Yeah, I think.
So where do you assign cost? Where are you thinking of cost, right?
Yeah, and just sorry, Chris, but that also goes back to the CEO conversation as well around the cost of capital around buildings and locations as well. So I'm not sure if you were just about to touch on that, Chris.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, it depends on what cost and also what the cost of change is. And then are we talking about capital outlay or operational cost? And that's where it gets tricky, because suddenly it becomes maybe a transformation that we weren't planning for at a time where our business is suffering a downturn. Because, there are other things going on globally right now which are, focusing the mind. So I think all those things get weighed up. I think if we start with Americanism, I guess, but a North Star, right? And we think about what does the best, role look like with the best outcomes. And from a business perspective, that's the most profitable, right? With the least amount of cost and risk, right? If you start there and you think about, okay, so how do we drive that? Well, we drive that with better experiences, less friction. Then we can start to think about, okay, are we restricted from a talent perspective in terms of a physical location? So if we want to do innovation and we've picked a particular location as that's where our head office is, well, COVID again threw all that out the window. People moved, right? People have dispersed because they could work remote, and then they don't want to commute. So now potentially, and that's just maybe in the country you're thinking about. If you think about globally, you could use these technologies to drive talent attraction in other ways. So certainly the benefits start to stack up, but potentially the costs start to stack up too. But if you marry that on a capital basis of a building versus providing some tech and some tooling, I'd probably argue that the tech and tooling, especially over time, is going to be more cost effective. The only last thing I guess I'd throw in is around the whole tax breaks piece, right? Because there's a whole element there that does play a factor depending on what somebody has purchased, acquired, owns, where it is on the asset, how old they've had it. So it becomes complex, but I think we've got to have those conversations with the right people and work out over time what's the North Star moment that we're trying to get to, and then what's the shortest route, most economical route to get there.
Crickets. Cool. No one's arguing against you. That's great. So we've talked about the impact of the employee work-life balance. We've talked about productivity. We've talked about the cost impact of the business. Let's talk about security. That's obviously one of the biggest topics around people moving and transitioning away from kind of bricks and mortar. What's the impact to the security element for a business? What should they be concerned about? What can they do to maybe remediate against some of those threats?
Well, something Charles said earlier about certain regulatory industries, right? Would you give your bank details to someone who can write something down on a pen of paper in the house? Sorry, how's that different to somebody in an office writing it down on a pen and paper? You know, unless they're getting body searched on the way out, or you've got CCTV, and then you hit into a privacy thing. I think I got your point. It wasn't me picking on your point. It was more a case of certain things we think are more secure, right? Give us a false sense of security.
Yeah, I think just be mindful of that. So there are certain banks I've worked with who have had and these are mobile free zones, mobile phones allowed to go in there, who are taking people's details down, no pads and paper. Literally, there's nothing on the desk apart from keyboard and stuff. So they are, if they're taking down private banking details, nothing apart from the keyboard. Yeah, there's always ways you probably can get around it, because what's being made by a man can be broken by a man, I guess, or woman. But I think that we sometimes think it's like VMware, we always simplify things based on the job functions and job roles and companies that we're familiar with. And I think there's lots of red tape and stuff. Like when Spencer, you mentioned before about if you had 50 different processes to get through to jump onto the network, well, I'll go and work somewhere else. Well, that's a really easy thing to say, but that's assuming you've got somewhere else to go to. And I sometimes think that actually we always think that technology is the answer. And if something's easier and better and faster, we'll go to an organization. I had this same conversation with the CIO of a large global media company, and he was like, we're going to call this our mobile, social, and cloud initiative. Okay. And I said, my view is if you do bring your own, I will stop people moving to another competing newspaper, and they'll stay. I was like, you're joking. If you're allowing someone to then go to another competing newspaper and give them a £10,000 uplift in the salary, they'll do that. It doesn't matter if you're going to let them do your own or not. So I think we just need to be mindful that.
Yeah, but that's when all things are equal otherwise, though, isn't it, Charles? Right? I know what you mean. It's not the only thing. Yeah, clearly, if you're being offered 5 times the salary and other perks, but it's all, and it depends on whether the labour market is tight or loose as well, and what the economic situation is. And I think if we go back a couple of years, the economic situation, given what was going on as well, but there was a massive labour shortage, and there still are in certain verticals, right? So I think it again comes back to what the macroeconomics are per vertical. But you're right. I'll suffer the pain of having to do that if I'm earning 5 times the amount, because I'll go out and buy a better machine at home. And
exactly. But I think to answer Brian, can I give you a thought on the security piece, Brian? I think there's a couple of things which jump to mind. One is overcomplicated security architectures. So that whole defense in depth, you put too much in place, you can't monitor it. And if you can't monitor it, how do you know it's secure? So that's kind of the strange situation we find in the industry nowadays. It's the only industry I know where it's acceptable to expect a customer to have 90 plus products to secure an environment. It's like we wouldn't expect that anywhere else. That's crazy. So I think that's one of the things we need to address. Not saying pull it all out, but simplify it and maybe integrate it, have a better platform, API integrated story. Strange enough, I'm going to say automation. Automation is going to drive repeatability. Repeatability is going to drive consistency and security. So I think if we can remove as much human intervention as possible on some of the mundane tasks, wherever that person's working, that is the way we should be striving to achieve. So for me, automation and reduction of security products would be the 2 things I would really talk to customers about.
Very good.
Yeah, and I think Brian as well. Like, we talk about outside hackers, and we think about that. And that's what's in the news, and there's been some recent big things, but there's also been some big examples of where it's just somebody simply. Got to be careful what I say here as well. Just downloading something and then giving it to somebody else in form of an Excel spreadsheet. So the risk security, it's not just loads of people being evil and trying to. It's not stupidity, but lapse or not concentrating or other pressures, which means you did something that then you've let IP go outside the company. So it depends what we mean by security there as well, I think.
Yeah.
Right. So I saw this great video the other day that somebody put up when they was presenting about zero trust. Got to get zero trust in there at some point. And it was a cat who has to go through these holes in order to get to some food. I don't know if anybody else has seen this. But it goes through and it's so somebody puts a little small, I think it's like a little bit of cardboard. So it has to jump over the cardboard. Does it, learns. So they put a bigger bit of cardboard. The cat learns again, jumps over the bigger, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And eventually, there's no space for the cat to get through. So what does it do? It just goes round because there's a hole the other side. And it's a great metaphor for what we've done with security. We see a problem, make it harder. We see another problem, make it harder. But it gets to a certain point where people just go around it anyway. So you've not really stopped the problem, and that's why you need a different approach. So as much as zero trust is cliche, there's a lot of merit around sort of changing to that methodology and not just adding and adding and adding, like Charles said, with more agents and another agent because a new threat's come out. You need a fundamentally different way of architecting it. And that's what the pandemic has been good for us, right? Some people have really decided that they can't just rely on that. Everyone's safe because they're inside the office and outside our LAN and inside our firewall. So if you haven't already done that, that's definitely something you need to do.
I think you kind of cast your mind back to a few years ago how we used to inside VMware position Workspace 1 and consumer simple, enterprise secure. I think that still really plays very well. And the whole coming back to your point there, Spencer, people and this kind of supporting this whole conversation, typically people, bit of a sweeping statement, I don't believe people typically want to go and be malicious in an organization. They do things by mistake. So they want to be able to gain access to the systems in the most simplistic way, minimum friction, but knowing that they're not going to do something which is going to jeopardize them, their career, or the company to work for. So I think if we can think about that in the whole context of hybrid working and try to simplify product stacks and automate where possible, hey, let's go and buy Workspace 1. That sounds like the right answer.
Yeah.
So it's a great answer.
Yeah. Again, I guess I don't necessarily disagree. I think it is minimum viable level of security or minimal risk thresholds, right, different for each company. Obviously, every security vendor or technology partner will push, we've got the most secure XYZ. It's like, okay, but do you need the most secure? It goes back to Spencer's picture of the cat, right? Does it need to be that high? Right? What are you trying to mitigate versus the cost versus, I guess, the engagement and the outcomes? If you just have a security conversation, you don't necessarily talk about it from a business lens. You're talking about it from a prevent everything. If you want to prevent everything and it's digital, then build a data center, put it in a shipping container, pour concrete over the top of it, put a load of locks on it, and dump it in the ocean. Right? No one's getting in.
Not sustainable, by the way, Chris, but I get your point.
It's not useful, but it's secure.
How do you put power into it?
That's a topic for a different day. Listen, guys, I've made podcast host error 101. I didn't set a timer at the start, so I think we're pretty well over time. No, definitely recorded. So I'll just finish up. I think it's been a good discussion, but I'll ask each of you to answer 2 quick questions. So in 30 seconds, just answer the question: is work from home dead on arrival? And what your prediction is for that space over the next, say, 3 to 5 years. Chris, you can go first.
Thanks, Brian. No, I don't think it is. And I think it will continue to grow, but not necessarily just work from home, but more of again, that balance, that hybrid way of working. And automation will be the key driver, I think, behind it.
Cool. Charles?
No, it was never dead on arrival, ever dead on arrival. And I think it will continue to grow, just not at the pace it's seen to get us through the pandemic to where we are now. I think it will carry on, but I think it will plateau and then slowly carry on, but much slower.
Spence?
No, it was never dead. Although I do think some people are trying to kill it. So it might need resuscitating if we let it go down that route, but it's never dead. It is the right way, and it just needs people to think about it in a proper way, and they'll get the best out of it.
Good stuff. Thanks for your time, guys. And I'll come up with an equally stupid question for the next one.
And out it. Cheers, Brian.
See you guys.
See you guys.